In the context of the Cold War, Thatcherism had an impact well beyond Britain. Indeed, policies in other countries, including those pursued by the Labour Prime Minister David Lange in New Zealand, were seen as reflective of the same shift in economic management. This is not to mention Ronald Reagan as President of the United States in 1981 to 89, during which time Thatcher forged a close relationship with him. It was Thatcher who was seen as the standard bearer for what Channel 4 dubbed in a series that aired in 1983 the New Enlightenment. The set of ideas dissected in that series had already come to be known as Thatcherism. Defining what that meant in practice is, however, not easy. Indeed, at the time there were lots of claims that the Conservatives that Mrs. Thatcher led were the pragmatic party. Ideology was seen by many Tories as something for the other side of politics. Pragmatism is, however, itself a form of ideology, and Mrs. Thatcher's praxis sometimes continued to draw on this. Furthermore, Thatcher was not the first Conservative figure of the post-war era to have an ideology attributed to her. Powellism, the mixture of economic nationalism, cultural nationalism, and racism expressed by Enoch Powell, was already in the field from 1968. In that sense, a shift towards ideology among the right and their followers was already visible before Margaret Thatcher joined with Keith Joseph in establishing the Centre for Policy Studies in 1974 or became Tory leader in 1975. Indeed, it might be argued that Powellism was one of the positive, in inverted commas, contributions to Thatcherism. Joseph, meanwhile, contributed to it in a variety of ways, not least by his recanting of his past support for a dirigist, big state, technocratic economic approach in a series of speeches in 1974. For him and his more decisive and photogenic ideological colleague, Margaret Thatcher, Thatcherism was thus defined within a specifically British past, involving a reaction and rejection of the post-war consensus and the technocratic approaches to it. Wilson and Heath had trying to update it in the 1960s and 1970s. That specifically British setting did not, however, prevent Thatcher and the term Thatcherism from having an enormous international impact, in part because of the memorable, if fuzzy, nature of the term Thatcherism. As we can see from this Kenyan cartoon on the slide here, at the time of her death, that impression that was conveyed was, however, not always favourable. The coining of the term Thatcherism was not meant to be favourable either. It first appeared in Stuart Hall's powerful essay on the Great Moving Right Show in Marxism Today in January 1979. Hall, pictured here, was a leading cultural theorist who had first come to prominence as a figure amongst the New Left from the 1950s onwards. At the time, he'd just published something called Policing the Crisis, and its analysis of the climate in which Thatcherism originated was informed by the racial tensions around law and order that were to explode in 1980-81 in the first term of Thatcher's government. The key point is that he is seeing Thatcherism as a response derived from a range of existing right-wing positions on matters such as moral responsibility, family, social order, and so on, which thereby provided a coherent narrative and an apparent solution within the framework Hall emphasised, of a perceived failure of social democratic approaches. Wilson had, for instance, failed to create a new consensus around a technocratic development of national champions. Even more, however, Thatcherism was a rejection of the failed, in inverted commas, policies of Heath and other post-war Tory governments. In that sense, this was a relaunch of conservatism, borrowing from free market rhetoric of allowing the efficient allocation of resources rather than the supposed dead hand of the state. In Milton Friedman's monetarism, it also found a different explanation for the problem of inflation, which had bedeviled Britain in the 1970s. If they could control the money supply, as Shadow Chancellor Geoffrey Howe argued, they could cut inflation and produce the price stability required for sustainable investment. The perceived failures of Keynesianism and social democracy, that is, using tax revenues to transfer wealth and welfare to poorer and more vulnerable parts of the community, created the space in which these Thatcherite alternatives came to seem plausible, indeed desirable. Importantly, however, Hall points out that Thatcherism was by no means confined to an economic ideology, even though contemporary commentary on her governments tended to focus on economic policy. Instead, it was given cultural resonance by playing on contemporary moral panics about welfare scroungers, enemies within, who undermined the self-reliant, morally upstanding, self-defined pillars of an imagined, embattled community to whom Mrs. Thatcher sought to. The core of Stuart Hall's analysis was around one particular aspect of social policy, education. This had been the portfolio held by Thatcher in Heath's government. She had not openly opposed Heath then, nor had she then espoused the Thatcherite approach delineated by Hall. Famously, Margaret Thatcher approved more schemes for comprehensivisation from local authorities than any other education secretary. By the time she left office, however, the influence of the Black Papers on education was steadily increasing. These attacks on progressive education were launched in 1969 and ran until 1977. Their launch came 2 years after the Plowden report recommended reductions in class sizes, the end of corporal punishment in primary schools, and a shift away from an emphasis on intelligence and attainment tests. There's a racial dimension to this movement towards a more progressive approach to education, getting away from the privileging of particular approaches and assumptions that led to widespread racist stereotyping of ethnic minority children in Britain in the 1970s. The Black Papers, on the other hand, presented the challenge progressive education posed to such approaches as an undermining of excellence, and indeed of morality. One of their champions, pictured here, was Rhodes Boyson. He was, like many people around Thatcher, someone who started on the left, shifting to the right in the later 1960s. A former head teacher, Boyson championed a return to traditional teaching and morality, which included a vehement hatred of homosexuality. Like a number of his fellow travellers from left to right, he was in this, arguably, more Thatcherite than Thatcher herself. The approach he championed had two important facets. Important, that is, as far as defining Thatcherism is concerned. First, it focused upon the notion that progressive education was both damaging education itself and corrosive of society. The classic example of this was the furore over Terry Ellis's management of William Tyndall's School in Islington in 1974-75. The perceived failings of this experiment led to calls for enforcement of educational standards. Second, these educational standards were to be around measurable outcomes marked by a focus on economic efficiency. Thatcherite approaches to education therefore mark school children as future units of production, not as citizens. The other theme Hall focused upon was, again, one not always focused upon in analyses of the Thatcher government. This was the law and order agenda that Hall had himself recently been scrutinising. The core of this was a moral panic about social disintegration, which was overlaid with an anxiety about apparently increased visible lawlessness, not least among ethnic minorities. The second generation of West Indians was coming to maturity, which meant that crime among young black youth was to become visible for the first time in the mid-1970s. After all, they hadn't been visible before this point. This perception and a shift towards high-profile and heavy policing in areas such as Brixton was to help create the circumstances for the Brixton riots of 1981. Containing these anxieties called for a rhetoric which required a fantasy representation of a Britain and Britishness under threat, which Thatcher duly delivered in her notorious Granada television interview of January 1978. In this she engaged in a bricolage of images, shifting seamlessly and contradictorily from an evocation of British liberty and democracy to the notion that these values were threatened by immigration. In this, Thatcher co-opted Powellism to her cause and launched her own pincer movement on the rise of the National Front that had appeared so alarming in 1976 to 77, in part by normalising some of their views and incorporating them into mainstream politics, not least through the radical clampdown on immigration imposed by the 1981 British Nationality Act. Hall, in his conclusions quoted here, recognises those contradictions of Thatcherism, but also that it fed upon a set of real or imagined anxieties and offered an apparently comforting set of solutions, in contrast to the chaos that the post-war experience of prices and incomes policy and gradual liberalisation of social policy had allegedly led Britain into. The radical surgery on a number of aspects of the state is being lampooned in this cartoon from the time of Mrs. Thatcher's death that we see at the top of this slide. What that tells us is that the facets Hall identified were not the only elements of moral panic which helped to cook up the elixir of Thatcherism, and now there was this attitude to the state, not least the growing number of unelected statutory bodies, then called quangos, seen as costly to the public purse and in which it was feared the left were heavily entrenched. Hall gave relatively little attention in contrast to the economy and still less to the trade unions in his analysis. Yet, for many of those drawn to Thatcher in the 1970s, the sense that the trade unions had become overmighty subjects threatening the stability of the country and its economy was palpable. This view was even widespread among trade union members themselves by 1979 in the aftermath of the Winter of Discontent. Indeed, the image of the Conservatives rescuing the country from industrial chaos was to be repeatedly drawn upon by Mrs. Thatcher during her premiership, not least as she faced down strike waves herself. In office, however, her approach was more cautious than Heath's. Instead of trying to set up industrial courts, arguably less necessary after the Labour government's establishment of ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service, in 1974, she used the reasonableness of democracy first to impose ballots and restrictions on secondary picketing in 1980. This was followed by attacks on clothes shops and further restrictive practices in 1982, an approach her Employment Secretary Norman Tebbit carefully characterised as providing specific remedies for real abuses. These developments were accompanied by a shift from prices and incomes policy, indeed facilitated it by weakening the trade unions as the shift instead to free collective bargaining occurred. Even more important was the dropping of the post-war commitment to full employment. Arguably, this had been already effectively abandoned by the Callaghan government in favour of inflation targeting during the 1976 IMF crisis. Yet, whereas Labour did so reluctantly while still seeking to maintain full employment, or as close to it as they could get, Thatcher's government saw inflation as the target, unemployment as something that would adjust. It did so, however, only slowly, following the radical blow landed on manufacturing by a combination of an overvalued currency and a sharp recession, partly induced by a spike in oil prices in 1980 to 81. If anything, it was the surge in unemployment to around 3 million by 1986, rather than monetary targeting, which never really worked under Thatcher, but proved most successful in driving inflation down. Incomes policy, if you like, by another name. One area that experienced wholesale shakedown of employment was the nationalised industries. Overmanning was just one of the accusations that was, with some justification, thrown at these by the end of the 1970s. Another was that they did not focus on service. Privatisation was partly about a shift towards a more consumer-oriented rather than producer-oriented economy. This shift helped to deliver the impression of economic success that made soaring unemployment palatable for those lucky enough not to experience it, and who bought into Thatcher's language of painful but necessary economic adjustment. It was also possible to finance it, avoiding the current account crises of the 1960s and 70s, because credit controls on overseas investment were lifted by Howe, overriding Thatcher's concerns, in one of the first acts of the newly elected Conservative government in 1979. So Stuart Hall coined the term and provided an outline definition to which, as we have seen, other elements of the problems of the 1970s, which Thatcher sought to overcome, need to be added. In the course of her governments, a number of other ideological debts were also invoked, including by some of her colleagues in office. Thatcherism has been portrayed as an attempted shift back to Gladstonian liberalism, but it didn't take the poor out of the tax system, but created a much more regressive tax system by shifting towards indirect taxes. It has been seen as an attempt to introduce the free market ideas of Friedrich von Hayek into government. Hayek's Road to Serfdom had Tory champions from its publication in 1944, and Thatcher was certainly one of a number of conservatives who consorted with the Hayekian think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs, founded in 1957. Yet neither Hayek nor the IEA were conservatives, nor indeed was Thatcher herself, in Hayek's sense, being someone who positively sought to change the agenda in her favour and direction, rather than simply opposing it. What, though, did that mean? Thatcherism embraced a number of positions: a restatement of individual liberty for you and your family's well-being, a view which touched upon social conservatism, self-help, thrift, and the simplistic morality of the quotation from Norman Tebbit's 1981 speech to the Tory Party conference, reproduced on this slide. Simplistic because it ignored the very real difficulties of adjusting unemployment in that way, as well as the differences between the 1930s, when the burden of unemployment fell on older people, and the 1980s, when the brunt of it was borne by the young. Furthermore, as Harry Enfield's louche caricature of an upper working class male Thatcherite, a plasterer with loads of money, made clear, thrift was not what many understood Thatcherism to be about. nor was it necessarily prudent financial management of the public purse. That was the rhetoric. The reality was transfers of assets to the already reasonably well-off, those who could afford to buy shares in privatised companies or to buy their own houses at often knocked-down prices. This was arguably the very antithesis of the encouragement of value for money or reward for effort that Thatcher instead so sedulously preached. At bottom, the core of Thatcherism was an instrumental application of those neoliberal ideas she saw as useful as a means to an economic nationalist goal of recasting the British economy and an electoral one of securing affluent former Labour voters. Insofar as Thatcherism had a coherent form, it was in its application to the state, in the wholesale adaptation of the ideas which have been floating around since the 1968 Fulton Report about spinning out executive agencies and creating internal markets in the public sector. In this, perhaps the core of Thatcherism was in fact management accountancy. These ideas and impulses were all, as Hall demonstrates, already there in germ in the run-up to Thatcher's accession to power. Indeed, she prepared as thoroughly in opposition as her predecessor Ted Heath had done. Much of this work was, in contrast to the domineering reputation she acquired as Prime Minister, delegated to particular teams. Thatcher was not always sure-footed as leader of the opposition, was considered over shrill at the dispatch box, and was by no means a certainty to win had Callaghan decided to go to the country in autumn 1978. She might then have ended up as a footnote in history. She was, however, perennially lucky in her opponents. The sobriquet the Iron Lady, gifted her by the Soviets, gave her a ready-made and useful identity, especially as the Cold War reached a new crescendo with the deployment of rival missile groups in Europe in the run-up to the 1979 election. She was also lucky in, if not always appreciative of, her lieutenants, such as Geoffrey Howe, who, with a team drawn partly from industry, oversaw the core thinking on economic policy in opposition, the Stepping Stones Project. This identified trade union reform as core to improving the supply side of the economy and therefore as core to the Thatcherite project. There's another dimension to this, which is what Jim Bullpitt in 1986 described as statecraft. This saw Thatcherism as a political project which deliberately used symbolic politics, the rhetorical narrative central to political debate, and moved it onto ground of Mrs. Thatcher's choosing on which she could win. As Stuart Hall pointed out in 1979, much of this work had already been done for her. Thatcher was simply the beneficiary of an existing mindset which had started to solidify, and all she had to do was adapt to and adopt this ready-made agenda. But she still needed to move the language and ideas of her political opponents into the realm occupied by policies that either were deemed to have been those which have already failed or were deemed to be irrelevant. This was achieved, Bullpitt argued, by a focus on the need to sort out the economy first, rather than those areas of policy that tended to play well for Labour, such as unemployment or welfare. These latter were rendered irrelevant, Thatcherism argued, until the overall economy was addressed, hence the emphasis on macroeconomics and the defeat of inflation. It was a rhetoric which had plenty of internal inconsistencies. For instance, the deliberate encouragement of a property-owning democracy through the tax system had plenty of inflationary implications. Nor was it particularly neoliberal, as core enthusiasms of Hayekians, such as education vouchers were ignored. Such radical ideas might have upset the delicate electoral coalition that the rhetorical confection of Thatcherism sought to construct. Indeed, although Thatcherism and neoliberalism have often been misleadingly treated as either closely related or more or less synonymous, there was much neoliberals disapproved of in Thatcher's programme. Compulsory competitive tendering, which saw the privatisation of a whole series of local government functions, for instance, was denounced by the IEA as an exercise in restructuring the market and picking winners rather than advancing consumer choice. Privatisation, similarly, did not radically marketise the sector addressed, requiring a whole series of regulators to act as guardians of the consumer. The result was that any quangos Thatcher got rid of at the start of her term in office were rapidly replaced by new ones. The idea that markets should be deregulated and opened up was nonetheless a leitmotif of Thatcherism, particularly when she thought it was in British interest if this happened. This was a characteristic of the push for the creation of the single European market, opening out services across Europe. This achievement, led by her appointee to the European Commission, Lord Cockfield, was trumpeted, rightly, as a move to increasing trade and allowing British sectors with competitive advantage to penetrate European markets. Yet this triumph was soured by a nationalism of tone also exemplified by Thatcher, not least by her success in securing a rebate on Britain's contribution to the European budget in 1984. This tone evoked a sense of English exceptionalism and strident playing to the gallery back home, which was to impact European relations in future, not least at the end of her premiership. The rhetoric, indeed, was often strident, including the division of her own cabinet into wets and dries in 1981. In this, Thatcher placed herself as an outsider within her own party, a populist ploy which presented her as the decisive figure driving policy forward. In practice, the reality was often different, as we see from the article cited here from Jerry Grimstone, a temporary civil servant under her. Privatisation proved to be the unexpected crusade. It wasn't necessarily central to stepping stones. Thatcher, indeed, was not always an early convert to some of the more radical policies of her governments. When she was eventually converted to some of these, such as the poll tax in the later 1980s, it also proved fatal to her survival in office. So one point I've been trying to demonstrate is that Thatcherism is not necessarily a coherent set of ideas. It's not even necessarily as coherent as Stuart Hall's dissection of it presented in 1979. Indeed, her later Chancellor of the Exchequer presented it in his memoirs as a curious mixture of a number of different facets. Within this, however, there is a number of overarching themes which give it a coherence as an electoral project, as an international project, as an economic project, as a project of social renewal and social reassurance that ties it all together through the personality of Thatcher herself. Thatcherism was of its time. It was a product of the circumstances of the 1970s against which Thatcherism originated as a reaction. in the process, it ties together a whole series of ideas, many of which, such as the notion of a property-owning democracy, had been a staple of conservative thinking since the 1920s. So Thatcher was a beneficiary of a particular conjunction in time. She didn't create those circumstances. Indeed, one might argue that in government in the early 1970s, she positively worked against them. She didn't coin the term Thatcherism, nor did she give it the coherence that Stuart Hall did. What she did do was capitalise on these opportunities. She was a beneficiary of the circumstances, of the perceived failings of Heath and social democracy that Stuart Hall drew attention to, and indeed the way in which prices and incomes policy, with the winter of discontent, seemed to have reached the natural end of its trajectory. Thatcherism then is not best seen purely as an ideology, more perhaps as a style of governance, as a particular approach which borrows almost magpie-like from a series of other ideas, whilst combining it with Mrs. Thatcher's own personality and sense of moral certitude. It wraps up in itself elements of Powellism, social conservatism, around those areas of education, law and order, and indeed race that we were talking about earlier. It trades on economic nationalism, and it instrumentalizes a value-based new public management, that is, this approach of marketizing elements of the state and using key metrics to try and establish what they're doing, which are of course only as good as the metrics that are being used, in order to, quote, justify their existence. This very process of new public management could undermine other elements of the Thatcher project. But in the end, the Thatcher project was about so many different things. But at core, it was advancing a particular reading of the economy, of Thatcher herself, and of the Conservative Party, which was her vehicle in all this. It's important to bear in mind as well that Thatcher was not only lucky in being the beneficiary of a particular historical configuration which played to these particular strengths, but also lucky in her enemies. Lucky in General Gautieri, giving her an opportunity to emphasize this supposedly decisive personality and leadership, which in many ways was not necessarily seen as one of her characteristics before 1982. Before 1982, indeed, she was not hugely involved in foreign policy. She was lucky as well in that Callaghan did not go to the country in 1978. If he had, at best, Thatcher could have hoped for a very narrow victory. If that had happened, we perhaps wouldn't be talking about Thatcherism now, or it would, at best, be a footnote in history. Instead, it came to bulk large in the historical trajectory of this country by the end of her 11 years in office.